Hello everybody, it's Root Beer. As we approach the end of 2022, and hopefully this video is actually up before the year is over, I thought now would be a good time to reflect on things. This year marked Vanguard's 10th anniversary, and I thought it would be interesting if we went back in time and reflect on how things have changed and evolved in those 10 years. This will be a multi-part series spanning from ye olden days of Boomer Vanguard all the way up until the end of V. At least, as a main format, V is technically still ongoing. Welcome to the Vanguard 10-year retrospective. Part 1. Early Vanguard was weird. Now, for anybody who's played a long-running game of any sort, that statement really shouldn't surprise you. Just look at the wording of old Yu-Gi-Oh cards for a good example of this.
No matter what the situation, neither player can offer any monster as a tribute.
That being said, early Vanguard does have a lot of interesting quirks and ideas for us to explore. For one, they hadn't quite decided on standardized power levels yet. While the majority of grade 3s at this time would be 10,000 power, some of them just weren't. You have cards like Dragonic Overlord and Ashura Kaiser just being 11,000 with no discernible logic for it. And then of course there is Gancelot, who was 9,000, although admittedly he is a bit of an outlier. Hi, Editing Root Beer here. This is just not true. There are actually a bunch of grade 3s that were 9,000 or less. It seems the logic they went with is anything that had easy power gain or card advantage would have lower base power to compensate. This also applies to grade 2s and 1s. So you have a card like Gigantech Charger, which is a 9k grade 3 that basically just calls a card for free. Luckbird is a 5k grade 1 that can Soul Blast 2 to draw a card, and Street Bouncer is an 8k grade 2 that can rest itself and another unit in the same column to draw a card. So yeah, I still don't really see a logic behind the difference between like 10 and 11, but for everything else there is a sort of logic there. Anyways, back to the video. This would be further complicated by the introduction of ride chains in BT3. Ride chains, much like modern-day ride lines, are a sequence of cards ranging from 0 to 3. They typically have some sort of effect when you ride the correct card in the chain, and oftentimes have effects that search out the next part of the chain as well. Our first iteration of this concept comes in BT3 with Tsukuyomi and Galahad. The way this first generation of ride chains worked is that each member of the ride chain would have the same ability that at the beginning of your ride phase, you can look at the top 5 cards of your deck, search for the next part of the chain and ride it. You then could not ride during the rest of that ride phase. And then you put the rest of the cards to the bottom of the deck in any order. The grade 2s in the chain would have an additional ability that let you Soul Charge 2 when you ride the grade 3. In regards to power, the grade 3s would have 11,000 base power, however they also had a negative effect where, if you did not have the other cards of the chain in your soul, they would lose 2,000, going down to 9. After this, in BT4, we would be introduced to the second wave of ride chains. This would include archetypes such as Amber Dragon, Enigman, Blouse, Giraffa, and Phantom Blaster Dragon. Yeah, that's right, Phantom Blaster was originally a ride chain. Unlike the first wave of ride chains, where you search at every link, the second wave could search out the grade 2 when you ride the grade 1 on top of the starter, and then the grade 1 has an ability when it's placed on rearguard circle that you can discard a grade 3 to find the grade 3 of your chain. The grade 2s don't have any searching ability, instead they just kind of do their own thing. In regards to power, where the first wave would lose power for missing the full chain, the second wave now gained power for getting the correct sequence. The requirement for that power was also easier to achieve, only needing the previous link as opposed to the full chain. After this, in BT5, we would get another new concept that would change the power dynamics of Vanguard: cross rides. Much like ride chains, cross rides would gain extra power when they had a particular unit in the soul. Thematically, these cross-rides were positioned as evolutions upon existing units, with Set 5 bringing us Phantom Blaster Overlord and Dragonic Overlord The End. These units came with 11,000 base power and would gain another 2,000 by having the previous iteration in your soul, bringing them up to 13,000 in total. They also had a negative effect where, if you had a unit from a different clan somewhere on your board, they would lose 2,000 power. And if you were paying attention to the visuals earlier, you may have already noticed that line of text on other cards shown. I didn't forget to talk about it, I was just saving it so that I could make a clever transition into our next talking point, which is that clan fight didn't exist during this period. If you had started Vanguard during or after G era, you would be used to clan regulation being the main rule for the game. You know what it is, you can only play cards from one clan. If you're playing, say, a Kagero Vanguard, you can't go mixing in cards from Narukami, for example. This was not the case in early Vanguard. You could play anything in anything if you really wanted to. And for a number of early clans, that would be necessary because some of them just weren't real. Like, they would just release a new clan and then not give them enough cards to build a 50-card deck. Pt.1 had 10 clans in it, and out of those 10, 6 of them were only given 4 cards in total. That is nowhere close to enough to build a full deck. It would often take 2 or sometimes even 3 waves of support before some clans became playable in a pure state. Or if you were Nubatama, it would take a whole 2 years before your clan became playable. And unfortunately, the thing that was oftentimes missing from a clan was triggers. The way triggers would work during this time is that you would need to have a unit on your Vanguard or Rearguard circle of the same clan as the trigger in order for the effect to activate. So if you check a Kagero trigger, let's say a crit, you would need to have a Kagero unit somewhere on your board in order for the critical to activate. So if you were one of the unfortunate clans that needed 3 waves to become real, Tachikaze and Mega Colony, then you either had to sit around sadly at your incomplete clan, or mix with another one, which could complicate deck building a bit. They would eventually get this figured out by around Set 5. Neo Nectar and Murakumo were introduced as complete clans. Also, fun fact, Bermuda Triangle wasn't immune to this either. If you're familiar with the current pattern of support, you might think that Bermuda Triangle was introduced in an extra booster, but no, they just got a bunch of random cards in Set 2, and then didn't become a clan until later when they did start getting extra boosters. Unfortunately, the lack of clan regulation at the time didn't really lead to any kind of interesting card design. The vast majority of powerful or high rarity units had some sort of clan restriction on them. The most notable exception to this is Majesty Lord Blaster, though that one only takes advantage of one particular unit in Blaster Dark. Of course, not everything had a clan restriction back in the day, which gave us one of the earlier budget/jank decks of the day, Invincible Overlord. Mr. Invincible was a rare introduced in Bt.1, and Dragonic Overlord came as part of a trial deck, meaning both of these cards were fairly accessible and cheap for budget players. The premise of this deck is that, because Dragonic Overlord works on the rearguard circle, you can pay for his Counterblast 3 to put pressure on your opponent, potentially wiping their front row, and then Mr. Invincible lets you countercharge and soul charge at the beginning of your turn, so you can refund those costs and use Overlord again. And while we're talking about paying a bunch of costs for things, let's move into our next topic, Mega Blasts. And, you know, things just kind of costing more in general. The Mega Blast was something that a number of early units had, where you could Counterblast 5 and Soul Blast 8 to do something. They also have an ability that allows them to Soul Charge 1 at the start of your turn, plus some other thing, usually gaining power, but it can also be something like a Countercharge or looking at the top card of your deck. The Mega Blast themselves were fairly powerful abilities for their cost, usually something like a board wipe or being able to restand all of your units. Many, but not all of them, were also on hits. A really interesting one was Still Vampire. That one could grab one of your opponent's rear guards and force them to ride it as their Vanguard. For all you youngins that came in after the reboots, the way guarding used to work was that you could only call something with a grade equal or less than your Vanguard. So if your opponent happened to leave a grade 0 lying around, not only would they be at a lower base power, but also they just couldn't perfect guard. Aside from Mega Blasts, cards in general just cost more than they did in the modern day. You have cards like Alfred and Dragonic Overlord that cost Counterblast 3 for their abilities, and many other cards would Counterblast 2 for things that we would consider pretty trivial these days, so like Blaster Blade and later on Gwyn the Ripper had to Counterblast 2 just to retire something. Tsukuyomi has to Counterblast 2 to draw 2 and put 1 from hand to soul. Phantom Blaster Dragon had to Counterblast 2 and retire 3 for 10k and a crit. He didn't even retire the opponent's cards back in the day. There are some outliers, of course. One that stands out to me is Amon. He can Counterblast 1 and eat a rear guard, and your opponent has to retire one of their rear guards. Obviously, in a time where card advantage isn't as available, eating one of your own rear guards is a much heavier cost than it would be now, but it is still pretty efficient, and it seems like something a modern day unit might still do. After a while, it seems like Counterblast 2 became their standard cost for things, with some cards costing Counterblast 3. We had a couple of cards that focused more on the soul in Soul Saver and Blazing Flare. Those cards both cost Soul Blast 5 for their abilities. Pt.5 adds the concept of Persona Blasting into the mix. This is where you would have to discard a copy of your Vanguard to pay for the cost of an ability, in addition to whatever other cost they have in Counterblast or Soul. Next up, I want to talk about a keyword that was introduced in the first set: restraint. Yeah, I didn't have a clever transition for this one. Units with the restraint ability couldn't attack while they were on the specified circles. Some of them only have it on the Vanguard, some of them have it Vanguard and rear guard. This was created as a balancing factor to units that had higher than average power. Most of the time, they'll have a way to remove restraint by either paying a cost or fulfilling a condition, or both. The example most people will recognize is Brutal Jack. Jack is a grade 2 with 11,000 base power. He can remove restraint by paying Counterblast 1, and when he's boosted by a Nova Grappler, he gets 5k on the Vanguard circle. It's an interesting concept, though they never really did anything with it outside a handful of units. Where they really seem to like using this keyword was in the first extra booster of the game, Comic Style. For those who don't know, Vanguard started its life as a manga, much like Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Comic Style featured a bunch of cards that were originally from the manga that weren't yet in the anime or the TCG. And for whatever reason, they just put restraint on a bunch of units in this set. 3 to be specific. There is Prowling Dragon Striken, which has a 10,000 base and restraint only on the Vanguard circle. It has a defensive ability where, if it's being attacked and there are no boosting units, it gets power plus 5,000 until end of battle. And it has a second ability: when another Kaguro rides on top of it, you can give your Vanguard 5,000 and a crit until end of turn. There is also Imperial Daughter, a grade 3 that has restraint on Van and rear. She has an ability that lets you remove restraint by paying Counterblast 1 and eating another Oracle Think Tank rear guard. She also has a continuous ability that, if you don't have any rear guards, she gets 10k and a crit and loses restraint. And lastly, we have Golden Beast Tamer. She also has restraint on Van and rear. She has an ability to Soul Blast 3 to lose restraint. She has a continuous ability that all of your Pale Moons in the front row get power plus 3,000, and when she's placed on the Vanguard circle, you can choose a Pale Moon Chimera from your soul and call it to rearguard. There are a few more cards that have the restraint keyword, though those wouldn't be introduced until after this era of Vanguard. And that's pretty much it in terms of weird or interesting card design, but now I want to take a moment to shout out specific cards that I think are cool or notable in some way. The first cards I want to talk about are the Forerunners from Pt.1, Conroe and Barkgall. For those of you who are more used to the modern game, Forerunners are starting vanguards that could pop themselves out of the soul when you ride on top of them. They usually feature some sort of utility skill that you could use on the rearguard circle. In the case of Conroe, that ability was Counterblast 1, retire itself, search your deck for a grade 1 or less Kogoro, reveal it to your opponent, put it into your hand, and shuffle. This was a very efficient and powerful ability, being able to search out any utility grade 1 you wanted. It was so powerful that when I started playing the game all the way in GBT7, Kogoro was seeing a resurgence of popularity because of the Kai Legend deck, and Conroe was still the starter. I'm pretty sure Conroe lasted all the way to the end of G. And his spirit lives on in D because D bar has the same ability. It's kinda crazy just how ahead of its time Conroe was. The other starter of this set was Barkgall, who has an ability to rest himself to search out Future Knight Lu and Flogel. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why would I want to call 2 triggers out of my deck? Well, you see, Lu has an ability that you can counterblast 1 and put himself, Barkgall, and Flogel into your soul to ride Blaster Blade from your deck on top of a grade 1. Yes, that's right, riding up early has been a thing since the very first set of Vanguard. And it was broken back then, too. I think once Majesty Lord Blaster came out and was one of the best decks in the format, Bushiro decided to put Barkgall on the ban list, restricted as first Vanguard. And it would stay there for the entirety of original Vanguard. They did not unban Barkgall until the end of G era. Hi, Editing Root Beer again. I'm interrupting the video because I forgot to talk about Trigger Forerunners. So in Set 1, for whatever reason, OTT and Nova Grappler didn't have starters. So instead, they used triggers as their starters, Battle Riser for Nova Grappler and Lozenge Magus for OTT. They both have the same ability to pop themselves out of the soul when you ride on top of them, and then they have another ability that when they boost, you can give the boosted unit 3000 power and then shuffle the trigger back into the deck. Because, you know, it would be unfair for these clans to have to start with 15 triggers instead of 16 because they had to use one as a starter, but it also means they have a somewhat unique ability of being able to shuffle a trigger back into their deck if they wanted to. I don't think this ever really made it past the first set, so this was just a weird little quirk of Set 1. Anyways, back to the video. Set 1 also featured Dragon Knight Aleph, a grade 2 that could Counterblast 1, eat Embodiment of Armor Bar and Embodiment of Spear Tar to ride Embodiment of Victory Aleph from your deck. Victory Aleph, as well as Gancelot, were the first cards to gain a critical. And of course, Dragonic Overlord is the OG restander. Though we also have things like Mr. Invincible and Ashura Kaiser for restanding rearguards. BT2 would introduce us to Silent Tom, the OG guard restrict. He would carry Oracle Think Tank for a very, very long time, up until GBT12 where they introduced Ichikishima, which was just the same thing but better. For BT3, I've kind of already talked about some of the cards that stood out to me in Still Vampire and Amon, but there is one more card that's pretty notable, Nightmare Doll Alice. Alice's ability is, on hit, you can Counterblast 1, put her into Soul. If you have a Pale Moon Vanguard, you can call a Pale Moon unit other than herself out of Soul. Multi-attacking already existed in Dragonic Overlord and Nova Grappler in general. The reason Alice stands out is, her cost is fairly cheap for what she is. It's only Counterblast 1, where other cards of this era were Counterblasting 2 or 3, or in the case of Ashura Kaiser, you have to drive check a grade 3. BT4 would introduce us to Phantom Blaster Dragon, a card that while very iconic, it has also never been all that powerful if we're being honest. The card that stands out to me in this set is actually Sternblau Kluger. Stern has the ability that when its attack hits, you can counterblast 2, discard 2, stand all of your units in the same column as it, and it loses Twin Drive until end of turn. This was before Bushiroad figured out that they could just write Drive minus X and it would be way less confusing. While restanding Vanguards did already exist in Dragonic Overlord, Sternblau Kluger stands out as being the first unit that can just attack the Vanguard and then get up and attack the Vanguard again. That isn't a Mega Blast. So there's a possibility you can pull it off multiple times, either in the same turn or across a game. While this is a very powerful ability, and in some ways the first of its kind, Sternblau Kluger would ultimately be overshadowed in BT5 by Dragonic Overlord, The End. This is quite possibly one of the strongest cards ever printed. Much like Sternblau Kluger, when its attack hits you can counterblast 2, but instead of discarding 2 you just have to Persona Blast, and it doesn't lose drive checks when it restands. This card was incredibly powerful upon release, and would see periodic resurgences throughout various eras. In fact, in D Standard right now, we're about to enter a period where Dote will be relevant because we're getting the promo that makes it good. This card is absolutely crazy, and I will absolutely be highlighting every time it comes back into relevance in future videos. BT5 also introduced us to Majesty Lord Blaster. Majesty Lord had an ability that, if you have Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark in your soul, he gets 2000 power and a critical permanently. This was a very powerful ability offensively and defensively, giving you consistent pressure across the board while also having higher base power. And then you had an ability that you could eat Blaster Blade and Blaster Dark to gain 10,000 when it attacks. Notably, this does not cost any counterblast and did not have any grade restrictions because Bushiroad hadn't figured that out yet. This card would be real crazy if you had a way of riding up early, huh? This set was so powerful and meta-defining that, in the English version of the game, Bushiroad actually changed the release order so that BT5 would come out later. It also seems likely that this set sparked a change in design philosophy. Originally, powerful abilities were restricted by various costs and restrictions, but by BT5 it was becoming too easy for cards to do their thing. This would change in future sets. Now, for your Vanguard to be able to use its abilities, you would first have to break your limits.